In 2019, when we announced economic mobility as the theme of our next Schul Forum following our inaugural event highlighting urban and rural connections, we could not have anticipated a pandemic that so shifted our daily lives. What we knew then was that a prominent study by Raj Chetty and his collaborators had surprised some of us, confirmed the lived experience of too many of us, and moved a lot of us to action. The Chetty study had identified our metro area as the 50th out of the 50 largest commuter zones in our country for economic mobility. Specifically, for a child born in poverty in our community between 1980 and 82, they were least likely among children in those 50 metros to move up to the top quintile of household income. Most stayed in poverty or only moved up one quintile, and only 1 in 3 moved to the top quintiles. The economic mobility outcomes were drastically different for white and Black children. In Mecklenburg County, 12% of white children born in the bottom quintile made it to the top quintile as adults. This rate was comparable to children in the most mobile cities in the study. In contrast, only 2.6% of Black children in Mecklenburg County made it to the top quintile as adults. The study and the ranking had staying power, and it galvanized action. When we made the plan for the next Schul Forum in 2019, we were ready to reflect on that action. What was showing early signs of promise in rewriting the Charlotte story? What was changing lives? What was moving the needle here and elsewhere? Where did we need to recalibrate? And then March 2020. Difficult for all of us in many ways, but disproportionately detrimental among our Black, Latinx, and poor residents across multiple arenas like health, housing, and work. Like the Great Recession before it, the pandemic has exploited the racial and economic inequities in our system, the same inequities that led us to our ranking on economic mobility. And so this afternoon, we gather to sit with those questions we had hoped to ask last year that remain relevant and perhaps even more urgent. Where have we moved the needle? Where do we need to recalibrate? How has the pandemic impacted this work? To lead us in our reflection on these and related questions, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Byron White, the moderator of our panel. Dr. White is the Associate Provost of the redesigned Office of Urban Research and Community Engagement, the Urban Institute's parent academic unit. He joined us at Charlotte last year and brings a range of experiences from leading a public-private partnership at the Strive Partnership in Cincinnati, to serving as Vice President of University Engagement and Chief Diversity Officer at Cleveland State University, the Vice Chancellor for Economic Advancement at the Ohio Department of Higher Education, and the Associate Vice President for Community Engagement at Xavier University, all following a career at the Chicago Tribune. Byron, I now turn it over to you to introduce our panelists and moderate our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. I appreciate that introduction. And as you've heard from Dr. Thomas and Provost Lorton, and the video we saw, a great tribute to our Gambrell Fellows, a big focus of our conversation this afternoon is going to be on solutions. We know that we've had a problem in this community for a long time with economic mobility. We're going to talk today not just about how we got here and some of the long-term factors that created the problem, but about what we're doing to effectively address these challenges and what we yet need to do to overcome them. Now, I'm a relative newcomer to Charlotte, having arrived last year to start this new position at UNC Charlotte. And I've spent really all my professional life in cities in the Midwest that have their own challenges, places like Chicago and Cleveland and Cincinnati. The issues facing these communities are no less serious than what we're talking about today in Charlotte. But the context is very different. Charlotte is a growing, quote unquote, new South city with a booming population, a swelling economic base, and growing resources. We don't face the problems of how to stop decline, stimulate growth, and generate wealth like some of my previous homes face. Instead, our challenges are centered around how to make sure that the wealth we are generating, which we can see splashed across Uptown's growing skyline and the gentrifying neighborhoods along the light rail, how that is spread more broadly across our community than it has been in the past. The inequities that existed in our community long before most of us got here are still reflected in our city today. Practices like redlining and urban renewal that contribute to segregation, disparities in which neighborhoods have access to fresh food and groceries and which don't, health access inequality that means people in some neighborhoods on average live decades longer than others. But how do we move forward? How do we make sure we don't settle for having recognized the problem and even begun the hard work to do something about it? What can we do to eliminate the disparities around economic mobility, to avoid repeating the same mistakes that might still be hidden from us, and to persist until there is true transformative change? That's what we really want to dig in on today. And we've got a great panel of local leaders to do that, who represent various sectors and all of whom work hard every day to explore these questions. We have on the panel Chancellor Sharon Gaber, another relative newcomer, who is leading UNC Charlotte into a new era of co-producing transformative solutions that advance our vision of a thriving and equitable community. Kacey Grantham of Red Ventures and Road to Hire, which connects underrepresented workers to high-earning careers through training, mentorship, internships, and job opportunities. We have Teddy McDaniel of the Urban League of Central Carolinas, which empowers African Americans and residents of disadvantaged communities to attain financial stability and social justice through education, training, placement, and entrepreneurship opportunities. And Laura Clark of United Way of Central Carolinas, who is leading new approaches to fulfilling the United Way's mission of improving economic mobility and advancing racial equity. And finally, Tonya Jameson of Leading on Opportunity, which was created in 2017 to oversee the implementation of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Opportunity Task Force report and its recommendations, which are dedicated to the idea that, quote, within a generation, every child in Charlotte-Mecklenburg will have an equal chance to achieve social and economic success. I particularly want to thank Ms. Jameson for stepping in to replace her colleague, Sherry Chisholm, who unfortunately had to tend to a family emergency. So let's get started. I'm going to start just and ask each of you if you'll take just about a minute to respond to this question. What do you mean when you say economic mobility? What does that term mean from the perspective of where you're working? Why don't we start with you, Chancellor Gaber?
Thank you. Really, when we look at economic mobility at UNC Charlotte, we're talking about taking students where they are and giving them the opportunity to get a college degree and change their lives. And, you know, we've talked, Provost Lorden talked a little bit about our statistics. Nearly 40% of our students are first generation. Nearly 40% of our students are diverse, and we have increased our Pell eligible students between 2008 and 2020 by 70%. So we're taking students from across our community and across our state and giving them the opportunity to have a college degree, which then will go on and change their lives. And so for us, we feel like we're an integral part of really providing an engine for economic mobility in this community.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. Kacey Grantham?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. White. So we actually talk about it as economic justice. And I think we're getting toward the same thing though, but we really think about it as not just opportunity, but the access, right? So the financial capital, the social capital, we focus on young adults, that young adults actually need to have the confidence they need, the tools they need, the financial support they need to access and thrive in high earning career path jobs that are going to lead to what we hope is, actually fighting intergenerational poverty in the long run, right? So that's how we think about economic justice and mobility.
Great, thank you. Teddy McDaniel, your definition of economic mobility.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I think at the Urban League, when we think about economic mobility, it's really economic self-sufficiency. And so we serve adults in job training and getting them certifications and livable wage jobs, youth on their way to college and or work. But we're also focused with every service on making certain that all of our clients have some financial education. And so we're talking about assets. And at the end of the day, mobility just means that you can take care of yourself financially as a family. And that's the mentality we have here. It's kind of an overarching theme, but one that I think at the end of the day, you've got to be able to be economically self-sufficient. And then you can be mobile.
Very good. Laura Clark.
Everybody, it's great to be here with you today. For United Way, economic mobility is really simple. It means that every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential, and that the zip code to which they are born does not predict their life outcomes. And what the Chetty study showed us was that right now in Charlotte, or at least when the report came out, unfortunately, that was the case for far too many children, and particularly children of color.
Very good. And Tonya, Jameson?
I'm going to kind of tag along with what Laura said. We at Healing Opportunity, we really look at our North Star goal that within a generation, every child in Charlotte-Mecklenburg will have an equal chance to achieve social and economic success. And we look at this really as a two-generation approach. We can't help these children if we're not helping the parents to be able to better educate their kids and provide the support that they need. So we really look at this as a two-generational approach and not a siloed approach as we're looking at the challenges facing our community as well.
Very good. I appreciate those themes of longevity, persistence to get there. This isn't a programmatic kind of response, and as well as a sort of agency and self-direction of folks to be mobile. Well, let's dig in a little bit more on the conversation. And I'm just going to invite all of you who are listening in if you have a question or comment, even as our panelists are responding, feel free to send those to the chat. And we have folks who will capture those, and we'll leave some time at the end to visit as many of those questions as we can and pose those to the panelists. So Laura, I'm going to come back to you and ask this. We've several of you have mentioned as I did, the Chetty report, and it has been called by many a gut check for the community. But I have heard you note that for many folks in the community, it was the least surprising set of data that could have been produced. So if in reality we already knew it then, what have we learned in the last 7 years since that report was produced?
Well, let me put some context around that comment. I do think that for those of us that were in the work, that had been running nonprofits, that were doing neighborhood-based work, it was very unsurprising because we saw the same families, generation after generation, struggle. We saw the same neighborhoods, the same zip codes, decade after decade struggle. Would we have said we were dead last? Maybe not, but I don't think that it seems surprising to a lot of us in the field, in the nonprofit sector at least, that we had a problem in Charlotte with people staying in poverty. What I think the Chetty report did, and the Opportunity Task Force report after that, was wake up a group of people that were not that close to it and did not understand that reality in Charlotte. And it forced us to look at, in some cases, what I would call our willful ignorance of the problem and address it. And the report very clearly, for the first time, and as a Charlotte native, I can say this, for the first time, called out the lasting impact of segregation and systemic racism as the underlying issue for all of this. And so what's changed, I think, has been that while many of us knew this was a problem, the focus in Charlotte has been very different from any other time we've tried to tackle something. I mean, here we are 7 years later, still talking about this. I can't remember a time that that's happened. And I look around at the nonprofit sector and the city and the county and everybody, and we're all still talking about it. And we're all still trying to figure out, how do we concentrate our resources in a way that we finally get to that systemic change and we get to a generational difference?
You know, I want Teddy McDaniel, I'm going to ask you to follow up with that idea. Laura is saying that this sort of shared journey we've been on, we're still talking about the issue. And certainly we've adopted a kind of shared terminology like economic mobility, which you all responded to at the beginning. I'm wondering if do you think we have a shared understanding of that term and the associated issues we're facing, even after being on this journey together? If so, and if not, how has that impacted our work?
Well, the short answer to your question is no. I don't think we have a shared understanding. Now, I'm going to put a positive spin on some of this. And I was really glad to hear Dr. Thomas acknowledge Dr. Ophelia Norman Brown, who was a mentor to all of us in this work. The other name, though, I think we should be talking about more is Julius Chambers. Because we're talking about economic mobility, and we're talking about, as Laura mentioned, decades of segregation. And when we're talking about children in schools, those are because of these decades of bad patterns, okay? Now, I don't think we have a shared understanding, but I think at least there's a framework, right? I'm gonna be optimistic about this. Leading on Opportunity started Opportunity Task Force. They had, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Tonya and others about this, some 100 recommendations. I got here 4 years ago, and I just drove around a little bit. And Charlotte had the tag in the New South. And I kind of said to myself, there's not much new here. It looks like the Old South. It is segregated. And there's a reason, we're that low. But the term itself is very broad. That's probably a good thing. Just like social capital is broad. And I guess I'll say positively that now there's a framework and people are choosing which way they want to invest in so we can get some things done. At the end of the day, we're going to continue to talk, and we should, but now it's time to invest and act and do. And quickly, I'll say, everyone knows that COVID exacerbated all these long-held disparities. It's true. But I think we're, have been at an inflection point the last year or two. And now we're seeing some investments going forward so some things can get done, because this is not new to those that have lived it and been in this work.
Thank you for that. You mentioned this sort of shared framework. I like that idea of what's holding us together. And I want to address a question to Kacey. I think a lot of times the solutions to addressing these issues and that framework really highlights the work of the public sector. It highlights nonprofits. Road to Hire is a private sector supported entity. And I'm just wondering, what is the role and contribution of the private sector in particular to addressing issues within this framework?
Yeah, thank you. So if we want to address systemic inequity, corporations just have to be at the table. I think there's no doubt about that. And I probably believe that more than I did 5 or 10 years ago when I started doing more of this work in earnest. And now they have to be at the table listening. They have to be at the table hearing what people in the community already know and are working on, what nonprofits are working on, but they have to be at the table. And they have to not only be at the table, they got to really be going up funnel Meaning if you're as a corporation want to hire employees and you want, employees who are well skilled and are, you have a diverse set of employees and you have all these needs, that means you have a responsibility to help prepare employees through, whether it's at UNCC, a partnership with UNCC, whether it's, all the kind of workforce development that we do in this community. And I think, perfect example, I forgot to turn off my notifications before we started this, and literally 30 seconds ago, I saw something pop up that said, it says, Grace just got her acceptance from Grace from West Charlotte just got her acceptance from UNCC, and it's this kid holding up her acceptance letter on her computer. That's a program that companies, the Charlotte Executive Leadership Council companies are actually funding, that we're doing in high schools and in partnership with UNCC. So I think companies are starting to recognize this and actually, raise their hand and be more of a part of the solution. And there's some that have been doing it for a long time. But I will say when I talk about the listening piece, my radar really goes off when companies or recruiters or somebody say, we just can't find talent. There's not enough talent out there. There's plenty of talent. People need skills, people need training, people need the financial access to education and all of those pieces, but there's plenty of talent. We, the private sector, really needs to figure out how to try new things and learn what the public sector has already learned and partner with the institutions that are doing this work in order to turn that talent into the skilled workforce that they need. So they got to be at the table and super involved.
Great, appreciate that. I see that several of you are starting to put notes in the chat and questions, so please keep that going. I also want to invite our panelists, as you listen to your fellow panelists respond to a question, I'll do my best to try to identify if you want to jump in, and so we're creating a bit of a conversation. Chancellor Gaber, I want to ask you, you're relatively new to Charlotte, like me. I think we arrived about the same time, but already you've really led the university in a bold articulation of our responsibility to these issues through the development of a new strategic plan. And I'm just wondering, how does that plan really advance the university's role in this ongoing effort around addressing economic mobility?
Well, thank you. So what I'd start by saying is, and you all have been keeping up with this, but the Charlotte Opportunity Initiative's updated materials in 2020 pointed out that there has been progress in economic mobility in partnership and looking through higher education institutions locally. And we, Charlotte, the university, we're a huge part of that. And I think when you start looking at the ecosystem of higher ed in our region, and the nice thing is all of the presidents and chancellors, we've started coming together and talking about what we are doing and how do we work together. UNC Charlotte has 30,500 students. We're big, and along with Central Piedmont, we work well together, but we are the public universities here that one of the words I think both in the chat and Laura used is thinking about access. So in our strategic plan, we've talked about access, affordability. We can't say that we want to help change the trajectory of what has been economic mobility in our community if people can't access the university. And really some of that is the affordability issue that we've talked about. In our new strategic plan, which we've laid out, it's a 10-year strategic plan. It's called Shaping What's Next. We've talked about a number of things, taking seriously our role in this community. So one of the goals, and I wrote it down so that I could quote it correctly, support the improvement of educational and socioeconomic outcomes for the Charlotte region by mobilizing university resources and community collaborations. We've called it out, we've said it's important, and we are going to work on this over this next decade. Things like provide opportunities for every student in the region's K-12 schools to engage with UNC Charlotte, increase their understanding of what's required for college admission, familiarize them with UNC Charlotte's academic excellence, things like build relationships with community-based organizations to activate the civic action plan and pursue community service opportunities. We realize our role is educating the talent and the workforce for our region, but it's also serving as a resource for our broader region. Once I got here, somebody said to me, Sharon, you have 30,000 students. Think about what kind of impact they could have in helping this community as well. And that's what we're talking about doing. And so I'm excited. I'm excited that we've recognized we're an anchor institution here, and that's part of what we have to do to be able to assist the metro area.
Great, thank you. So Tonya, kind of put you on kind of the cleanup hitter here a little bit. You've heard this sort of first round, a mix of new opportunities and efforts that are going on, challenges that are still before us. Leading on Opportunity was really created out of the box in response to the focus on economic mobility following the Chetty report. So I just wonder, overall, how do you think we're doing as a community in terms of really demonstrating tangible improvement since that effort started, in light of the comments you've heard?
Yeah, as Dr. Clark mentioned, the fact that we have our entire community, public sector, the nonprofits, the corporations are talking about economic mobility and equity, and improvement is an improvement of what we've seen in the past. And as others have mentioned, the greatest success of the task force report really was increased awareness of and community-wide focus on those factors that pose barriers to economic mobility. And when we look at some of the hard data, or like where we can say, plant a flag, we've seen Mecklenburg County commit millions of dollars on their 6-year plan for universal pre-K for all 4-year-olds in the county. And when we talk about housing, we know there's the affordable housing shortage that you all have documented well in your reports. But we have to acknowledge that the entire community, again, philanthropic, corporate, government, really rallied around this, investing and increasing for funding for affordable housing. We had the commitments of the $50 million housing bonds. The Housing Trust Fund has produced more units than were projected because of those funds that were raised. And we've seen CATS increase frequency on more than a dozen routes to shorten wait times for buses. And all of that were specific things that were identified in the task force report. Now, is that enough? Have we moved the needle as much as we want to? Of course not. But these problems didn't occur overnight. So these types of investments will take time to significantly pay off. But what it does show is that the community and government bodies are willing to take the steps necessary to improve some of these indicators that the report highlighted. So yes, we've had some successes, but we know there's a long way to go. As Chancellor Gaber laid out, they have a 10-year plan for the types of impact that they want to have and how they want to roll out implementing what they're working on at UNCC.
So let's flow a little bit into that more we need to do that you're mentioning. Laura, I'm going to come back to you on this one and ask, you are, the United Way is hands-on in many ways with a whole range of organizations working on this issue, from large civic organizations to grassroots community-based efforts. And I know you're hard at work at seeing how to elevate that work. So I'm just wondering, what's your assessment on how we're doing? Are we doing what it's going to take? What's most needed, do you think, to really move the needle on this issue? And what more do we need to figure out more precisely? What does need to happen?
Sure. So I'm optimistic that the community is staying focused in a way that we are bringing the resources together in a sustained and concentrated manner in order to see change. I want to be really clear, and on behalf of all of our nonprofit partners, the nonprofit community alone cannot change this, right? We've been working on these issues for a long time, and often we're doing it without the support of other sectors in the community, without acknowledgement. But the short answer is, from a nonprofit perspective, especially from a health and human services lens, are we doing everything we should be doing? The answer is no. I think Charlotte has to get more comfortable with the idea that some of what we've always done, that we love, that is beloved in the community, may not be the right things to do. It may not be research informed. It may not be demonstrating outcomes. It may not have taken into account the perspectives of those most impacted by these issues. So United Way, for example, has committed to holding the mirror up. We started this journey when the Opportunity Task Force report came out and said, look, we've been an institutional funder for 90 years. We've done things basically the same way. Clearly, we're not doing all that we can. So what is our role as a funder, as the largest private health and human services funder in the community? And we've completely overhauled our strategy. And are moving more towards place-based funding that is driven by the residents of the communities that are most impacted and to grassroots Black and Brown-led organizations. It doesn't mean that the agencies we have funded over the years haven't been doing good work at the individual level and have achieved outcomes for those individuals. And I don't want to minimize that. But I think we've got to take a more narrow collective focus and get serious about the levers that are really going to move economic mobility. And everything isn't going to do
that. Kacey, I want to come to you with this. Just a couple things from Laura's comments. One, the acknowledgement that the nonprofit sector can't do it alone. What we've been doing requires some innovation and new thinking. And this idea that there, are some new levers that are needed. I just wonder from Road to Hire's vantage point, what are the obstacles, the barriers to that kind of shift in innovation and obtaining those new levers? Are there things that your organization sees as impediments to getting there?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Laura more, and I love this question because I think for when we talk about obstacles to, in our case, really, right, like young adults getting into hiring careers, but really anyone kind of maybe career changing or wanting to move into a different field, I think we think of obstacles as barriers from the student's lens or the young person's lens of lack of access to childcare, maybe lack of resources to afford school. And those things are very real and are real challenges and barriers. But if I had to nail it down to one thing, I would say it's the biggest barrier is an obstacle is inertia and risk aversion from the side of companies, of institutions that are going to employ folks. And just a lack of willingness might even be the wrong thing, but a little bit of being scared to try something different, to try something new, to make long-term plans. I'll steal something I heard from Teddy yesterday, I think, is we got to do some longer-term planning and be willing to invest in folks and take some risks. So I think there's real structural change in how we need to think about and prepare talent coming from the workforce development lens. And it has to be collaborative. But it has to be that inertia is going to be our biggest obstacle. And
go ahead.
I would love to hear what other panelists kind of think about obstacles, because that's just one that comes to my mind, but I'm sure there's lots of others.
Dr. White, I'll chime in. And thank you, Laura, and thank you, Kacey, for your comments. Inertia is a good word. Charlotte has always had the money to do things. They haven't had the will. Let's just call it what it is. I think some of that's changing. To the point about the role of the private sector, you need public-private partnerships, right? You need the nonprofit sector, you need the for-profit sector, you need municipalities. But one thing I also want to point out, I'm gonna go back to Julius Chambers, because there's some policy things that need to change. One of the more shocking things when I got here was I've said the segregation. But remember, we were the model after his lawsuit at integrated schools. Well, over the decades, that's changed and reversed, right? So some of these are self-inflicted wounds, right? Let's just be clear about that. And until we change some of that, we can do a lot, but we're gonna have some challenges. Kacey made a comment earlier about talent. And there are a lot of us in workforce development, help people get jobs. We've always had the talent, right? But companies have to work with us in the community, take their blinders off. I still think that there's some racial issues that people just don't want to talk about. We see it every day. And I'm talking about for those in the minority communities who have degrees, who have talent, but are woefully underemployed. You have to ask the why, even when they have the necessary credentials. This is about will. And I think we're having some progress. I often say that the Chetty study and maybe shame some folks into action. Tell the truth, like whatever it takes. And unfortunately, we had to have the deaths of Keith Lamont Scott, and George Floyd, and others to get to this inflection point, which is a positive, because now more people that look like the white community are joining this chorus. That's great. We need that. But I know everybody wants to keep moving forward. We have to, but don't forget about past policies that have gotten us here in the first place. And I'm not talking about the 50s. I'm talking about in the last 20 years, 30 years. Until we change some of this, we're going to still have some real challenges.
Kacey, I just noticed, Kacey, it looks like you might want to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, you reminded me of something, Teddy, which is I think another thing we've got going on is like numbness or complacency a little bit. And the Chetty study maybe lit a fire, but it's so easy to fall back into complacency, and we just have to fight against it every day. I think if we all started from zero and went into, a school in a Crescent versus a school in the suburbs, we'd be like, how are we possibly letting children get such different education? Like, we would be hair on fire, but we're numb to it. We're just so used to it.
Yeah, I agree, and I want others to chime in, but let's not forget about white flight. That's a real thing, right? And now we have a reverse where people are coming back into the cities. That's a positive. But, there's the old saying about Sankofa, look back where you came from so you don't repeat. And Charlotte's got to make certain we shine a spotlight on it, right? So we don't repeat.
So let me ask, are there others? So I'm just taking notes here, complacency, inertia.
Byron, can I jump in there too?
Absolutely.
I add to what Teddy's saying about will. I don't know if it's necessarily only will. I think a big part of it is trust. And it's trust in that nonprofits who are closest to the work can, help come up with those solutions. It's trust that integrating and, diversifying our neighborhoods is not going to lead to the downfall of society as we know it. It's trust in doing things differently than we've always done them. So when you talk about who has access, as Teddy said, we have the talent, we have the students, but if the students don't have the social capital to get into these rooms that will give them the opportunities to show their talent, then they're not going to be able to succeed. So I think trust is something that we can't lose sight of when we have these conversations. And then when Teddy was also talking about policies, I think one of our challenges, or one of, at least my goal specifically in Leading on Opportunity, is to help get our corporate partners to look at policies in a different way. So traditionally, when you think about corporate partners, you're looking at policies that impact their particular business. But what if we got the collective will of our corporate partners behind policies that actually impact some of these determinants that we're talking about? That's not necessarily in their business wheelhouse, but it's going to help them get the talent pipeline that they want and help whether it's the parents or the children. But if we can get the corporate sector behind some of these policy issues as well, then we could really move the needle both on a local and state level with this.
So let me invite, because this question of obstacles clearly is ignited the panel, which is great. I just wonder, Laura, Sharon, any insights into this particular issue of obstacles? We've talked about will, inertia, we've talked about policy, racial biases that yet need to be addressed. Go ahead, Chancellor Gaber.
I'm not sure I've been here long enough to jump in the same way that everybody else has been. I mean, certainly everything that everyone has said in terms of will and inertia. And I mean, you can see some of that. And that is, I think Teddy's point about making sure we look to the past to understand where we're going in the future. It's critical. Right. And, you know, I think at a university, we try to teach people that. And yet sometimes we miss that along the way. So I think we've covered it. Right. You know, somebody made the comment that there are plenty of resources, and I think we all inherently understand there are plenty of resources in our community, and yet they aren't always free flowing in the exact same way, and not always going to the projects that we would say are going to have the biggest return on investment to be able to shift and continue to change the trajectory and where we want to be in economic mobility. So resources may be there. It's the misalignment of where they're going, perhaps at times.
So one advantage to being relatively new, right, is you have fresh perspective from other places. You're an urban planner. You've been a senior higher education executive at a number of institutions in a number of places. And I just wonder, as we work through these, are there insights from those experiences that you might see that we, really should double down on or really invest in here?
Well, I jokingly say at the university, there's no problem that money won't solve. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that we all know that, if you have the resources, what you're able to do is endless. Somebody asked in the chat about, saying it would be great for students to go to college, but there's the access question about does that eliminate the disenfranchised? And the reality is that's part of what I know I have to do, and we as a community have to do, is ensure that students whose families haven't gone to college and whose families have zero financial ability to pay for college still have that opportunity. We're doing that, and we're out showing people what does it look like to fill out a FAFSA form. What does it mean to have resources? Our endowment is not as high as many of the longer lasting or longer serving institutions, universities that have been around for 200 plus years. It's a lot different than a university that's been around for 75 years. But we have to grow that because I want to ensure that every student has the opportunity to get a college degree. And I think Central Piedmont, I'm not saying it's this university, although I'll tell you it's a great university and somebody's going to come here and change their life, but Central Piedmont, to be able to have a skill, a trade, a profession that you then go ahead and change your future. And all of my colleagues in higher ed, what we know is individuals who get a college degree go on to earn nearly $1 million more in the course of their life. So the question about, I was on a conversation yesterday about student debt. We're working proactively to reduce student debt because we recognize that's a scary thing. People don't want to take it on, but the average student leaves UNC Charlotte with $20,000 of student debt. Over the course of their life with a college degree, they more than make up for that. And it's a worthwhile investment. Most people are willing to invest in a car for that amount of money or more. This is an investment in a future and the ability to have a career and a job. And, we were talking about skills, and I think there are so many, unfortunately, for better or worse, there are so many jobs that say, you have to have a college degree just to apply. It's not about, do you have the one-to-one skill associated? They're looking to see, did somebody persist in this educational pursuit? And were they willing to think and to write and to hone a set of skills to come out with a college degree? And I before anybody jumps and says, you don't have to have one, which I understand there is a group of people who feel that. What it does is it provides a platform or a springboard for individuals to change the trajectory of their lives. So What I would say, and my goal is to get into every high school to help students who never thought of going to college. And I see Tonya's got her hand up there, who never thought of going to college. Everybody does. Okay. This is an opportunity to change their future trajectory. And everybody's jumping in now.
I know. So, hey, I'm going to ask Laura to give a response first, though.
Sure. So mine is a little broader to what you asked a few minutes ago. What we haven't talked about is values and where we place value in our community. I started my comments by talking about the opportunity for children to reach their full potential. Do we believe that every child on West Boulevard deserves the same thing that a child in South Charlotte does? Do we believe that young children deserve the best early education we can give them so that some of the other things we've talked about will be that much easier? Do we believe that teachers deserve a living wage because they're taking care of our most precious resource that we have, which is our future? Do we believe that childcare workers deserve something more than living in poverty? And I will say that I think we have bright spots. And when you look at the work the county has done to expand pre-K, to make it universal, I think we are getting attention on these issues in a way that we haven't before, that is saying we value those things. But we've got to keep at it, and we've got to take those examples and hold them up and push other people to do the same.
So, Teddy, I know you and Tonya want to jump in, but I want to piggyback on this comment a little bit and Teddy, ask you to respond, because this idea of values and affirmation of the community as an underlying notion is very much in line with what we're going to hear in some ways from Dr. Perry in his keynote later, this idea of assets of communities where we often describe from a deficit standpoint. And that affirmation seems core to what Laura was talking about. Do we have that shared value? And I wonder if you might speak a little bit to this idea of, how we are we acknowledging and upholding these communities and residents as assets to the community in a way that we need to in order to make the changes we're talking about?
Not to the extent we should. I often call Charlotte the city of 1,000 neighborhoods, right? Every few blocks. It's really interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned assets when you're talking about language, because for too long in Charlotte and other places, it's deficit language. That's what we do. Like, we talk about at-risk youth. I don't believe there's any such thing as an at-risk youth. I think if you put youth in risky environments, things can happen to them. But that's deficit language. When it comes to neighborhoods, the assets are the people in those neighborhoods. And it's not just on Beatties Ford Road or the west side. It's the east side. It's the north side. It's all over. But the other thing, let's not forget, for decades, Black communities, and now we have an emerging Hispanic population, and those are growing, they had assets. We had wealth in the community. And I'm not talking necessarily about 7 decades ago, right? So we've got to reinvest in those people, in those neighborhoods. And yeah, I'm gonna get into housing just for a second, because Chancellor Gaber, I'm glad you mentioned student debt, because we all need to be working on the racial wealth gap and closing it. And one way to do that, because it disproportionately affects students of color, is to get rid of this debt they have to take on to go to college. Now, I'm the son of college educators. I teach certifications at the Urban League. And I say a certification gets you a job, a degree will get you a career, and others. Plus, don't forget, we got to teach young folks to think critically. And even if I get you a trade, that might not happen. Life changes over time. But I think that we're making progress, but let's think about investing back in the neighborhoods who have a lot of pride in history. And we can move forward.
So I want to get to that, and the queue of comments and questions from folks listening in is piling up. So I want to get there quickly. But before I do, Tonya, just wondering, I know you had a comment a little while ago. I'm wondering if you still wanted to make that comment before we move to some of the questions.
I just wanted us to make sure that we also don't talk about this in a silo of just getting the kid to college and giving the kid the resources to go to college, because that child who cannot necessarily afford, or the family who can't afford, the family may not be able to afford for that child's income that they're working in their part-time jobs that contribute to the household income to lose that, so that the kid can focus on college. So a big part of this, I think, is we have to really talk about this more holistically. Same with Chancellor Gaber. I appreciate you talking about FAFSA, but you're talking about also people who are dealing with a digital divide, and so much of FAFSA is online. So how are we addressing that? So I just want us to also make sure that we're thinking about this and talking about it in a more holistic terms, and not just trying to focus on one specific thing, and not the wraparound support that's needed to help get that child into school and to persist to graduate.
Very good. Let's bring in some comments from folks who are viewing and listening in. My screen is to the right with a lot of those comments, so forgive me for looking away. So there are some questions here that Katarina Swearingen started and others that have to do with the longevity of the work, right? This is generations long kind of work. And yet, we're talking about immediate needs right now that are going on in the community. And so she raises, and others have alluded to, this challenge of addressing long-term systemic change, which we know we have to do, with individual needs right now in the community. And how do we reconcile these goals in the work that we're doing? So who would like to take that on? Laura, go ahead.
Take a stab at it. I said yesterday to a group of folks, and some of the panelists were on this call actually, that we very much have to balance the urgency of now with the fortitude needed to stay focused on the systemic change. Because we cannot forget that there are people in our community suffering right now that need shelter, food, basic services. One way I think we address that is by engaging the community more in even how those programs that are serving individuals are being administered. So that's part of what United Way is doing, is we're funding more grassroots, neighborhood-based organizations that are closer to the problem. And we're also building that resident leadership at the neighborhood and grassroots level so that they have the skills and tools they need to advocate, whether it's with the city, the county, the school system, whatever, to start to see those changes. It cannot just be, candidly, a group of white leaders that decide, we want to change X for a community. That community has to be resourced and empowered in a way to advocate for that. So the way United Way is looking at it is that it's a both and. I mean, a lot of the grassroots and neighborhood organizations we're funding now are addressing those immediate and basic needs, but we have a long-term lens on how do we lift up the entire system. And we think that by changing how we fund, building that resident leadership, being a partner, being an ally in that advocacy, we will start to see some of that systemic change.
Very good. Kacey, did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, we and Laura hit on this at the end. We cannot think of them as mutually exclusive or as direct trade-offs with each other, right? There are ways that we can be solving issues for people today that actually make the pie bigger. And that workforce development, I'm so passionate about it because of that, as I see young people go through either community college or apprenticeship programs, and just I see them go into jobs where I'm like, that their kid is going to be able to go to whatever college they want. Like that person's going to be, or not, and whatever they want. Like that is going to, and so that's one small example. But we have to reject the premise that they're trade-offs in order to get there.
Very good. Teddy, were you going to respond to this one?
Sure. I do think that we are collectively looking at things, which is a real positive. But one of the things, hey, this forum is being hosted by a university, public university. Your pipeline are young folks in the K through 12 system, Charlotte, and around the country. And if we don't start talking about closing the achievement gaps for students in the K through 12 system, guess what? We're gonna have the same problem in a few years. And so, and this isn't to be disparaging. It's not just CMS. We got charter, we got private, we got all kinds of schools. But we got decades of achievement gaps that have to be invested in and closed. If we're going to seriously be talking about economic mobility for those at the lower end of the spectrum, I think that's, and I just saw in the chat.
Yeah, and there are a number of questions in the chat emerge around education and, how in the world, why, education in particular in the public school system it kind of shows up in these disparities in such a particular way. And I don't know, you're speaking to it now, Teddy. I don't know if others might want to respond to that focus on education. I know we've talked a good deal about opportunities, particularly through higher ed, but what is it in the groundwater in particular around education that makes it such a core issue here?
Goes back to what Laura said about values. Like we have to value it equally for every student. That's just what came right to mind. It's her saying that. We just can't accept it anymore.
One other kind of area of questions, it's sort of, and Sharon, this might be where we could tap into your urban planning perspective, but it's a recognition, and Mary Newsom raises this, that the Chetty report, while we focus on Charlotte, really, it wasn't kind to a number of cities and locations in North Carolina, and that North Carolina, often shows up behind on a number of indicators around economic mobility and disparities. And so, as we think about this, how do we reconcile what's happening right here? We're talking about the neighborhoods, but to what degree is this also a component of a more regional or even statewide set of conditions?
Well, I think, and it's interesting just to follow the sets of comments because, lots of perspectives on the structural nature as to how we got to where we are and whether, as you're asking, the regional or statewide, whether there's the will to change some of this, right? And I think everybody has said that in a different way. I think that Charlotte has said the will is there, the resources are there. I think several people have said, we're talking about changing policy, we have to take action. A couple of people have said, we're still not paying our teachers appropriately. We're not rewarding some of the fundamental pieces. That's what it's going to take. That is what it's going to take. And, there are communities that have decided you're going to change the structural nature of what is consistently replicating this issue. We have to, I'm going to always advocate for higher education, but the comments are correct that we need to approach it much earlier and we need to begin to reward and value. So Laura said, what are our values? We need to value the things that are in fact going to change the trajectory for us. And it's not just when somebody is 18, 19, but fundamentally in the beginning, and make sure we're valuing daycare and education and make sure that and we again can do this. We have the ability, we have to have the will to change the structure. So some cities have structurally changed things to have different outcomes. And I think somebody asked about changing policy. That's what we have to decide we want to do.
Very good. I want to, Mark Jensen's raised a couple questions, and Tonya, I'm going to put you on the spot to start a little bit with this, because, these are questions about, African-American communities. He has addressing the erasure of those communities, certainly the transition and change and gentrification, all of that aligned to economic development, and how do we address that? Atrium's Innovation Campus, and how do we make sense of that? And particularly raises, the mayor's new $250 million racial equity initiative as at least an expression to think comprehensively about racial equity in the context of development. I just wonder if you might start that conversation of how you see that initiative and how it plays out as it relates to these questions.
I love Mark Jensen. He always keeps us on our toes, or keeps me on my toes in various sectors here in the community. But, we're really excited about the Mayor's Racial Equity Initiative. To be clear, though, it is a separate initiative from Leading on Opportunity, but we're excited about this as an example of, the latest example of our public-private partnership. At Leading on Opportunity, we're really focusing now on college and career readiness. It's a priority area for us. So we're particularly excited when we talk about the Mayor's Racial Equity Initiative about the focus on JCSU. Mike Rayland, I hope I pronounced your name right, but Mike Rayland put in the chat about the 30-year study conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank and how the median wealth of Black households have dropped by 84% over the past 30 years. But we know that HBCUs play a critical role in improving economic mobility for Black families. They supply more Black applicants to medical school than non-HBCU institutions. They graduate 40% of all Black engineers, 40% of all Black Congress members, 50% of our Black lawyers, and 80% of Black judges. So, improving college career readiness, we have to really focus on HBCUs and JCSUs specifically here in the Charlotte community. So we were all really excited about the announcement of the financial support to JCSU, but along with that are the internships that they announced, and Atrium, I think it was Atrium talking about they're going to help with the pre-med curriculum at JCSU as well, and the commitments from the local companies for apprenticeships and internships. And so that's really a step in the right direction. So we're excited about the announcement, and it really the focus and the attention on JCSU specifically.
Any other reactions to these issues, and particularly the mayor's initiative and how it may?
Yeah, Byron, I'll chime in. I think it was an absolutely exciting announcement. But for clarification for people that may not know, there are different work streams within that initiative. So JCSU was a priority area. The other one, though, that should be as talked about is eliminating the digital divide. In Charlotte, it is up front in these neighborhoods, lack of broadband. One of the more exciting things I think for Charlotte is the growing fintech area. For IT, folks, the companies that are coming here. Well, those are the careers that these young folks and not so young folks need to be prepared for. Well, how do you do that if they don't have access to digital tools to get there, right? Whether it's at JCSU or all over, or K through 12 systems. So I think that was an exciting announcement of investment and commitment from public and private partners. But this is where the work starts, right? It's great. We got to have investment. Now we have to put the work in so that these things get done over time.
Laura, I just wonder, as you kind of think broadly about the United Way's path, how these more recent initiatives might weave into some of the work that's been underway.
I think that's one of the amazing opportunities we have before us as a community, is that because so many of our institutional partners and others have taken up this mantle of improving economic mobility, we have the opportunity to align those efforts in a way that we haven't before. So with the mayor's initiative, for example, one of those work streams is the corridors of opportunity. These are historically under-resourced, under-invested communities that the city is going to put major investment into, mostly through economic development and some housing initiatives. One of the things United Way is looking at is, okay, if they're doing that, how can we bring our funding to health and human services to bear in those same corridors, right? How do we start to layer on these things so that we really do have a tapestry of strategies that will help us get to economic mobility? We're not all out there trying to do it in silos or on our own. So I'm excited about the fact that, Fifth Third made a major announcement about the Beatty-Square Road corridor a couple of weeks ago. So I see some synergy and some momentum in some places that I really do wake up optimistic every day that we have the potential here to get somewhere we haven't been.
So, this idea of, and there's a lot of comments along these lines, and you all have talked about the primacy of community participation leadership, the legacy of communities. I know Chancellor Gaber, a big part of the strategic plan for Charlotte really calls out elevating that history and legacy of the community and the region. It feels, on the surface when we're talking about these issues, almost like a soft issue, and yet it keeps coming up in the comments and elsewhere. It's being so critical to moving forward. And I just wonder if we could speak a little bit to this idea of, and maybe it goes to Laura's point about values, this idea of community affirmation and agency. Why is it so important? We're talking about jobs and, these concrete things. Why this component of the work around the people and the places, and really overturning a legacy of them being diminished and oppressed in the work? How is that done, and why is it so important to going forward?
I mean, I'm happy to speak to it a little bit. I know others will have opinions as well. I think it requires us to build a different muscle. I think that our institutional leaders and the way we've operated historically as a city has been a very, closed door, kind of small group of people making decisions, and relearning how to bring in the community is new and different. And it can feel threatening to people, right? For people that have been in power, have had the access to the resources. One of the things United Way has started doing over the last few years, when we make our funding decisions, it's always been a volunteer-led process, but it's always been corporate volunteers making those decisions, right? We've completely flipped that on its head and said, for our neighborhood-based and grassroots investments, it needs to be the people in those communities making those funding decisions. We are there to support the process, but at the end of the day, they're the ones deciding what's best for their community. But that's a very different thing for a traditional United Way. That's just not how we had operated. So, you've got to build a muscle around that. You've got to build some expertise, and you have to build trust with those communities that you're going to do what you're saying you're going to do. You're going to honor that. And so often those communities have had broken promises made over and over again.
Yeah, I agree with Laura and Byron. I'll say this. I think the positive is we're starting to invest not only in the grassroots organizations there, but in their ability to help themselves, right? Like, I'll never stop saying this. The things that are happening, the positives, the businesses, this is not new to minority communities. And so many people are frustrated because Charlotte has had, I guess I'll call it, a patriarchal type of philosophy. We give you some money, come in and help you all. Well, that's frustrating to people who have known excellence and have known success, right? We don't need charity. We need investment, right? We had a lack of it. And so I think we got to change the mentality in addition to the things we're seeing on the horizon. And I'll end with this. I do think that there's a lot of collective activism now that we got to continue.
Any other thoughts on that? And particularly this theme of reversing, a lot of comments here about the destruction of Black neighborhoods, right? Which speaks to this and reversing that. in the way we're talking about. Eric Orozco points out that the mayor apologized for the city's role in damaging urban neighborhoods through urban renewal programs of the 50s and 70s. So, are we doing that work in terms of acknowledging and coming to grips with those kinds of issues from the past? It sounds, in light of what Laura was saying, that we have to continue to do that. Are you seeing that weaved into the various initiatives that you all are leading?
I think it's a continuous approach, because if you think about when the mayor put out her statement from the city standpoint, county commission also passed their proclamation. The Chetty report had been out for a while, but you didn't really see that type of movement until the man who was murdered by police up in Minneapolis. That's when you started to see, yes. So that's when you started to see government leaders say, we really need to address racial equity. We need to address the racism that has put us in this position in the first place. And I think it's our role in the community to keep that front and center. As some people get tired of talking about it, they don't want to hear about racism, they don't want to acknowledge racism. But then when these types of flashpoints happen, when these tragedies happen, then we bring it back up as if we've not been trying to address it in the past. So I think we have to keep it front and center in the work that we do. And it's our role, the people on this panel and those who are leading these community groups, to help make sure they hold our feet to the fire and don't let us just kind of sweep it under the rug and then move on to the next issue.
Very good. No, I really, really appreciate that. So I wonder, I was going to ask a question about had emerged here. And go ahead.
I'm just looking at the chat. There's a lot of questions. There's a new med school being announced, which I think is an important big step for a city like Charlotte. We're the largest city of its size in the country not to have a medical school. And I saw this happen in Austin with the University of Texas a couple of years ago. And if done well, those kind of investments help the communities, if done well. I think that's a community effort, in addition to the money and the millions of dollars it takes to get one. But the other thing I think to be discussed is arts and culture, like in Charlotte. And I know that's important to a lot of people in the community. And I'm starting to see more arts and culture in music and in arts themselves by Black and brown artists. I'll be honest, I was shocked when I got here because I felt like a lot of the culture had been just kind of mowed over, right? I didn't see a traditional, in 2017, Black History Museum or Black art store. And I was accustomed to seeing in cities of this size around the country. Well, you're starting to see that now. I think that's a positive. People want to see their own culture, Black, brown, white, music, all of that. And they want to feel that where they live. And so I think that's a part. And look, there's a funding issue with arts. We know the investment that has been made. But whether it's on UNC Charlotte's campus or Johnson C. Smith, a historically Black college, or in the city and around, you cannot discount arts and culture when it comes to economic and social mobility, especially for people of color.
I wonder, that is a great point about the arts and its role in all of this. I wanted to also point out one question that came up, a comment earlier from F. Triggs. And we've talked a lot about sort of as a community coming together, addressing issues, even acknowledging and as Tonya pointed out, evolving in the acknowledgement of some of the particularly racist practices and policies that got us here. And yet all around us, we hear, this, a country divided, these deep schisms, and we're witnessing it in, trials going on across the country, right? And so I just wonder, how do we reconcile what's happening locally in this sort of spirit of collective work with this broader narrative of division in the country? Are we an aberration, or do we see, are those things potentially interfering with the local work that we have to do here? Chancellor Gaber, I'm going to put you on the spot because you, as a new arrival, have done a pretty tremendous listening tour as a new chancellor, and getting out and talking to a number of civic partners and alumni and others. And I just wonder what you're hearing in terms of the potential for the level of collaboration folks are talking about, given these broader reverberations of division.
I think it's a great question. And, so I was looking at the panel, I'm thinking, okay, wait, I'm probably the only public employee other than you, Byron, on this. So I will, as an entity of the state of North Carolina, I want to recognize that I will speak just as an observer and as an educator here. I will say that I do believe, in fact, Charlotte is somewhat unique in its ability to come together. So this panel and this group talking about this topic, having a mayor who has identified, a racial equity task force and the streams within that, how many, and we could ask the panelists, how many cities have had a mayor say this is a priority and that there are resources that we collectively need our community to invest to be able to make progress? There are lots of cities where there might be some public funding that goes toward that, but our mayor has managed to not only identify some public resources, but also then work with nonprofits, work with higher education, work with corporations and say, we need to have investment in this way. I do think it is unique. I think we've all said there's much more work to be done. And I think some of that is sort of the follow through and the steps that come after this. But if you look across the country, there aren't that many cities where your leaders will take that proactive a step to make progress. I mean, in some ways I'm fascinated just being a part of this, so I appreciate it. And I appreciate the comments, just watching and thinking about all of the issues that people are discussing. Somebody asked about recognizing the history, which I think was Teddy's point earlier. And, certainly I'd say that's the value of higher education. And all of our education is understanding history, where we've been, to understand where we want to go. I do think there's something unique in Charlotte. I do think, this group and everybody who's communicating, who says this is critically important because it was done in a short period of time. So, Tonya mentioned George Floyd's murder and the timing of that. We know when the Racial Equity Task Force started working. We know when the announcement associated with $250 million came together. That was a relatively short period of time. Somebody else in the chat asked about all of the philanthropy going on in our community with the med school, with the arts, with UNC Charlotte, with several other, Wake coming in with the med school. The resources are here, and I think that's what you'll see is those resources. The med school is looking at $500 million in terms of fundraising. I'm confident they will hit their target along the way. So part of what you have here is the will, the ability, the resources. It's just bringing it all together. And I think that's, again, what the esteemed panel here has been saying. As somebody who's been in other places, change doesn't happen that quickly in very many places. Many of these issues are, You know, I know Byron and I have talked before, and he was in Cleveland and I was in Toledo. We've seen some of these issues, and we also know the legacy associated with many of these issues remains in other cities, and the resources aren't there in the same way to address them. So I do think that's an opportunity here that we have to continue to pull together.
Yeah, I think Chancellor Gaber, I think that's well said. It's unique, but Charlotte also has to continue looking at peer cities where a lot of these investments have been done over the decade.
Absolutely. Agree.
Right? There are models of investment in action. And, you know, every city looks at their peers, larger and smaller, for progress. And let's not toot our own home too much, because we can get on the plane and not fly very far to see things that have been working. And they do that as well. So
I think too, we want to make sure we don't live in kind of this a bubble a little bit. Not everybody's in our community knows there's an equity initiative. Not everybody in our community is, you know, has the time or capacity or interest in following this work. And so I think Charlotte is unique in the ways that the Chancellor outlined and Teddy outlined, but I also think we're not unique in a lot of ways around, you know, let's say segregation, right? So somebody in the chat probably an hour ago asked, like, what's the one thing you would do to change it, you know, kind of the economic mobility challenge. And I don't know the answer to that, but one thing that comes to mind is, to me, is like proximity to each other and segregation. And just that is such an entrenched, cancerous issue for our community that I think that if we're unique in that way, it's on the bad side, not the good side. So that piece to me feels like we can't get lost in our bubble or get blind to some of that piece.
So as Tonya, were you going to jump in?
I was just going to go back to the original part of your question about whether or not we are the country divided. And Charlotte is, in a way, sometimes though. Charlotte, Asheville, Greensboro, we are in a bubble in a way, because when you think about our state legislature, before joining Lead Opportunity, I worked in political campaigns. And our state legislature also prevents us from doing a lot of the change that we want, from fully funding public education. If we look at the Leandro case that's going on right now, from requiring inclusionary zoning when we talk about affordable housing. So the divisiveness that you see on the federal level, we can't expand Medicaid here because our state legislature won't allow us. So we do see it every day here, even in Charlotte, how the divisiveness that we see on a national level trickles down and impacts us locally, because the changes that we want, we can't necessarily make them. Someone in the chat also mentioned that some of the because of Charlotte's growth, more people are moving to the rural communities. So the rural communities are experiencing the same problems that we're experiencing here in Charlotte, but they're controlled by more conservative legislators. So they still can't get the movement and the help and assistance that they need on a state level to make the changes that are necessary as well.
So I'm going to take those last two comments as a start of our wind down here as we get ready for our keynote speaker, and sort of ask, as you look out on the horizon, knowing that, you know, there are still challenges ahead and there are unforeseen challenges as well as ones that we're staring right in the face. Just sort of what each of you might say we ought to do to make sure we're best prepared to forge ahead. Still a lot of work to do. If, you know, paying attention to, you know, make sure we're paying attention to state policies and those issues that Tonya mentioned. Kacey mentioned this issue of connectedness, paying attention to those impulses of segregation and really addressing them aggressively. You all can take those as your contributions or add another one, but let me ask each of you what you would say. Let's make sure that we're looking out for this as we forge ahead if we're going to have the success we're looking for. So
I'll start.
Yeah, Teddy.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of positive, but we cannot gloss over some deep held issues that we're trying to get past. at the Urban League, we're a service provider and an advocate, do both. And I think it's important for us to build capacity to be in community. I often say we're not a talk tank or a think tank, we're a do tank, right? So you should judge us on what we actually do, but we don't do things on our own, right? And so I think the positive here is to stay in this collective work atmosphere, because it's been too many silos in Charlotte. In our sector, it's a lot of competition. You know, Laura and I talk about this kind of stuff. We have to deal with it. But I think as long as we're have collective minds and get like-minded people working towards a goal and keep telling the truth, man, we'll move forward.
Like that, stay in this collective mindset. Laura, Sharon, either of you?
I was driving somewhere the other day, and as per usual lately, every road I was on, it felt like there was one lane closed with orange and white barrels, right? Do you feel that way, that like every road has a lane closed? And I got so frustrated, and then I had to kind of stop myself, because how lucky are we to live in a city with that kind of growth? And it does bring problems, and it brings challenges, and particularly to some of our most disinvested in communities and communities of color. But I know there are other cities that would give anything for that kind of growth, that kind of economic development. And I think the challenge for us is, how do we use it to the advantage of everybody in this city, right? How do we make sure that growth, Charlotte's desire to be a bigger and better version of itself, how do we make sure that nobody is left out? And it's going to take that long-term tenacity over time, that we stick with this and we don't get sidetracked and we don't forget the children and the families and the neighborhoods that are at the center of it.
I like that tenacity. Stay focused on this task that's gotten away in the past. Appreciate that.
Well, and I'm just going to say, and I think others have said it, but it's continue these conversations and continue them, not just in this way, which is almost an academic sort of, we're all coming together and we appreciate the group that's offering commentary, but continue it in our churches and in our community meetings and in our public schools. And, I think of going back to my urban planning education, and the ways that plans often are disseminated are through elementary age school kids to get them to begin to think about it. I know that we've had conversations about making sure that elementary kids begin to think about the fact that they can go to college to change their lives. We have to start young. We have to change those narratives, and we all have to continue to work together. I've had the good fortune of meeting many of the people on the panel. I've only been here just over a year, but we haven't always figured out how nonprofits and advocacy groups and workforce training, we're all working to promote the same ideas and bringing this together in a different sphere and place where people might actually hear what we're saying and are willing to jump in and move forward and be part of this collective momentum.
Chancellor Gaber, thank you for doing my job of wrapping up this entire conversation and bringing it to a close. I think that's what university chancellors just do better than the rest of us. So listen, I just want to thank everyone for a great discussion. Thanks for being forthright and bringing some real insights to this ongoing challenge for the community. And for everybody listening, especially those of you who provided commentary in the chat and questions and kept us going and instigated the conversation, I appreciate that as well. I am at this point going to turn the event over to Dr. Thomas, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Andre Perry. So thank you all very much.